If you look at a list of major companies from, say, 1962, and then you check which ones are still truly dominant, culturally relevant, all the way through to today.
The list is incredibly short.
It's tiny. You get a few banks, maybe a massive retailer, but in entertainment, it's almost a list of one.
Right.
And that's what we're looking at today. This isn't just about a rock band. We're analyzing a genuine anomaly of survival. We're looking at a cultural institution that has somehow navigated, well, 6 decades of everything.
It's true. Changing trends, bitter internal feuds, legal battles, personal tragedy. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around that kind of longevity.
It really is.
In the context of pop music, a 5-year run is considered a massive success.
Yeah.
10 years, and you have a legacy.
Sure.
But over 60 years,
That's
it just unprecedented.
Yeah.
We're talking about an entity that has sold over 250 million albums.
And the touring numbers are just astronomical.
They've broken touring revenue records again and again, often just breaking their own previous records. Their cultural footprint, it rivals almost any other entity in the entire history of entertainment, not just music.
And that is exactly why we need to unpack this. The goal for this discussion isn't just to, list their greatest hits.
Everyone knows the hits.
Exactly. We want to understand the mechanics of their survival. How did they pivot from being basically a London blues cover band to being called the greatest rock and roll band in the world?
What were the business decisions that really revolutionized the entire music industry?
Yes, and we need to get into the details, the things the average person might not know.
Right. The technical stuff.
We have to talk about how they became tax exiles, the complex financial structures they built that kept them afloat when they were almost bankrupt.
And even the fact that, and this is amazing, there are actual fossils named in their honor.
It's a massive story, so let's set the stage. We need to go back, way back to a very specific moment.
A chance meeting.
October 17th, 1961. We're at the Dartford Railway Station in Kent.
Platform 2, to be precise.
Okay.
This is the moment of ignition. It's the spark. You have Mick Jagger and Keith Richards meeting, sort of by chance.
Now, they knew each other from before, right?
They did, but it had been years. They were childhood friends, classmates back in 1950, but then they lost touch when they went to different schools.
Oh.
So more than a decade later, they just bump into each other on this train platform.
And I've read that this wasn't just a polite hello. The thing that really sparked the conversation was something Mick Jagger was holding.
It wasn't just that he was holding records. It was what records he was holding.
Okay.
Jagger had a stack of LPs under his arm. He'd ordered them by mail from Chess Records in Chicago. He was carrying albums by Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters.
Which, in 1961 England, was not a common sight.
No, not at all. You have to remember, you couldn't just walk into any shop and find these. They were imported treasures. That specific musical taste, that gritty American Chicago blues, that was the immediate bond.
It was a signal.
It signaled to Keith Richards that Jagger wasn't just a casual pop fan. He was a serious devotee of the blues, just like him.
So that meeting, that's what leads to them forming a musical partnership. But, when we think of the Rolling Stones now, the absolute core is the Jagger-Richards partnership.
Of course.
But in those earliest days, that wasn't the case. They weren't the leaders, were they?
No, and that's a common misconception. In the very early years, the uncontested leader of the band was Brian Jones.
Right.
He was a multi-instrumentalist, a real blues purist. He was the one who actually formed the band. He placed the advertisements in Jazz News looking for other members. He brought them all together. He negotiated their first gigs. He was the driving force.
And he was the one who named the group.
That's right. The story is just fantastic. Jones was on a phone call to Jazz News.
Oh, yeah.
He was trying to book a gig or maybe place an ad, and the person on the other end of the line asked him for the band's name.
And he didn't have one.
He had nothing. He panicked. He looked down at the floor, and there was a Muddy Waters LP lying there. One of the tracks on the album was called Rollin' Stone.
It's incredible. One of the most famous brand names in history came from a moment of panic and a glance at a record on the floor.
It really speaks to how improvised and spontaneous those early days were. After that, the lineup solidified pretty quickly.
So you had Jones, Jagger, Richards.
And Ian Stewart on piano, though he was later sidelined from the main lineup for image reasons. And then eventually Bill Wyman on bass and the great Charlie Watts on drums.
I want to stop on Bill Wyman for a second. I read a fascinating detail that he was hired partly because of his equipment.
Yes, it was a very practical decision. They were impressed by his playing, sure, but specifically, Wyman owned a Vox AC-30 amplifier.
Which is a big deal at the time.
A huge deal. In the early days of gigging around these tiny London clubs, having a powerful, reliable amp was a serious asset. It meant you could actually be heard over the crowd. So it wasn't just about his bass playing, it was about the hardware he brought to the table.
So you have this band. They're playing blues covers, building a following in clubs like the Crawdaddy, but they're stepping into a world where the Beatles already exist, and they're exploding.
Right. The Beatles are becoming a phenomenon.
And this is where the strategy shifts completely. This is where Andrew Loog Oldham enters the picture.
Oldham is such a fascinating character. He was only 19 years old when he became their manager.
Younger than the band members?
Younger than all of them, yeah. But he had this incredible vision. He'd worked briefly for Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, and he realized something absolutely crucial.
What was that?
The Stones could not beat the Beatles at being lovable. It was impossible. The Beatles had the matching suits, the synchronized bows on stage, the charm. They were the boys next door.
So he went the other way?
Completely the other way, the opposite direction. He positioned them as the anti-Beatles. He famously took the S off Rollin' to make it the Rolling Stones, but more importantly, he orchestrated their entire image.
He crafted it.
Meticulously. He encouraged them to wear unmatched clothing. He wanted them to have long hair, to look, unclean. He wanted them to look threatening.
I think the quote attributed to him is that he wanted them to look like a raunchy, gamey, unpredictable bunch of undesirables.
Precisely. And he used the press brilliantly to build that image. He fed these provocative headlines to the media, the most famous one, of course.
Would you let your daughter marry a Rolling Stone?
That's the one.
Looking back at it now, does that bad boy marketing actually hold up? I mean, a band wearing different jackets doesn't seem that rebellious today.
It seems tame now, of course.
Yeah.
But you have to put it in the context of 1964 Britain. The post-war generation was still very conservative. The idea of young men with hair touching their collars, looking scruffy and surly, that was genuinely shocking to the establishment.
He created a choice.
He created a binary choice for the youth of Britain. You could like the polite, clean-cut Beatles, or you could side with the dangerous, threatening Rolling Stones. It was one of the first times in rock history that a bad boy image was so consciously manufactured as a marketing tool.
But there's a problem with the music itself, wasn't there? They were still playing blues covers. Come on, not Fade Away.
Little Red Rooster, yeah. Oldham saw a ceiling there, a very clear one.
Why?
2 reasons. First, relying on covers limited their income. They weren't earning songwriting royalties, which is where the real money is.
Right.
And second, it limited their longevity. If you're just a tribute act playing songs by middle-aged American bluesmen, you're eventually going to run out of road with a teenage audience. You need your own voice.
And this leads us to the famous kitchen story.
This is pure rock and roll folklore, but by all accounts, it's absolutely true. Oldham allegedly locked Mick Jagger and Keith Richards in a kitchen.
Some accounts say a bedroom.
A kitchen, a bedroom, some kind of room. And he told them, "I am not letting you out until you've written a song." He literally refused to let them leave without original material.
That is an incredibly high-pressure creative environment.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
And their early attempts were apparently not great. Oldham described them as soppy and imitative, but they kept at it. And the real breakthrough came in early 1965.
With The Last Time.
Exactly, The Last Time. That became their first self-penned UK #1 hit.
And that changed everything for them.
Keith Richards later called The Last Time the bridge. He said it gave them the confidence and the understanding of how to write for the Stones. It wasn't just a blues cover anymore. It was their sound.
And once that floodgate opened, it just became unstoppable. Later that same year, you get I Can't Get No Satisfaction.
Global explosion.
And the story behind that riff is fascinating to me because that iconic guitar tone, it was never meant to be the final version.
No, not at all. It was an accident. Keith Richards recorded that riff using a Gibson Maestro FZ1 fuzz box. It was a new piece of gear at the time.
And he was just using it as a sketch.
Purely as a placeholder. He recorded that fuzz guitar line as a guide track to show where a horn section should eventually play. He wanted it to sound like a big brass line, like something you'd hear on an Otis Redding record.
But the producer, Andrew Oldham, and the rest of the band heard that demo.
And they said, no, that's it. That's the sound. They kept the fuzz guitar.
I read Richards was actually reluctant about it.
He was. He thought it sounded too gimmicky. But that decision, keeping that gimmick, it defined the sound of rock radio for that entire summer. It went to #1 everywhere. It was the moment they became true superstars in the United States, not just another act from the British invasion.
As Jagger and Richards took over the songwriting, the dynamic in the band really started to shift, particularly for Brian Jones.
Right, the founder was no longer the primary creative force.
But Jones didn't just disappear into the background musically. He evolved.
He absolutely did. Jones was a musical sponge. As the band moved into the mid-60s, especially around the Aftermath album in 1966, he started picking up every instrument he could find.
He became their secret weapon.
He really did. He wasn't just a rhythm guitar player anymore. If you listen to Paint It Black, that distinct droning sound that makes the track so memorable.
That's a sitar.
That's a sitar, played by Brian Jones. On Lady Jane, he's playing a dulcimer. On Under My Thumb, those marimbas that drive the whole rhythm of the song.
Also Brian Jones.
Also Brian Jones. He added this incredible texture and color that separated the Stones from being just another standard blues rock outfit. He made them sound exotic and worldly.
So they're at the absolute height of their fame. Creatively, they're on fire. And then the establishment decides to strike back.
Yeah.
We have to talk about 1967 and the Redlands raid.
This is a pivotal moment, not just for the band, but for British cultural history.
Yeah.
It starts with a tabloid, the News of the World.
Yeah.
They ran this big feature called Pop Stars and Drugs, Facts That Will Shock You.
They were explicitly targeting the rock elite.
Oh, absolutely. They published a story claiming a member of the Rolling Stones was taking drugs at a club in London.
But they got the wrong Stone, didn't they?
They did. The reporter had actually been eavesdropping on Brian Jones, but for whatever reason, the paper reported it was Mick Jagger.
So Jagger sued them.
He sued them for libel. And that lawsuit essentially painted a massive target on their backs. The establishment saw them as arrogant and wanted to make an example of them.
Which leads directly to the raid on Keith Richards' country home, Redlands, in February of '67.
It was a massive police operation. 19 police officers descended on this quiet country house party. It was a huge show of force.
And Jagger and Richards were arrested?
They were. And the sentences that were handed down were just incredibly harsh.
Shockingly so.
Mick Jagger was sentenced to 3 months in prison for possessing 4 amphetamine tablets, which, by the way, he had bought legally from a pharmacist in Italy.
And Richards?
Keith Richards was sentenced to a full year in prison, not for possession, but for allowing cannabis to be smoked on his property.
A year in prison. That seems wildly disproportionate, even for the time.
It was meant to be an example. The establishment was trying to crush this symbol of youth rebellion. But it backfired on them.
How so?
It sparked a massive public debate about personal freedom, about the power of the state. And the most famous defense came from a very unlikely source.
The editor of the Times, William Rees Mogg.
A pillar of the conservative establishment.
Right.
He wrote this famous editorial. The headline was, "Who breaks a butterfly upon a wheel?"
It's such a powerful image.
It is. He quoted the poet Alexander Pope,
Yeah.
and he argued that Jagger was being treated far more harshly, simply because he was famous, than an anonymous young man would have been. He basically shamed the courts.
And it worked.
It did. It helped shift public opinion. The convictions were eventually overturned or reduced on appeal, but the damage was done. In terms of the band's innocence, let's say, they realized they were being hunted.
And tragically, not everyone in the band survived that kind of pressure. As we move into the darker part of the late 60s, Brian Jones was really deteriorating.
Jones was not psychologically equipped for that level of fame and scrutiny. His drug use had become a severe problem, a hindrance to the band's work. He became more and more strange.
And there's a practical issue, too, wasn't there?
A huge one. He couldn't get a visa to tour the United States because of his drug convictions. For a band that was conquering America, that made him a serious liability.
So in June of 1969, he leaves the band.
Or else was asked to leave.
Right.
It was effectively a firing. He departed, and the band very quickly replaced him with a brilliant young guitarist named Mick Taylor.
And then less than a month later?
Less than a month later, on July 3, 1969, Brian Jones was found dead. He had drowned in his swimming pool at his home, Cotchford Farm.
It's just a heartbreaking end for the person who actually started the whole thing. And the Stones had this massive free concert scheduled in Hyde Park for just 2 days later.
They decided to go ahead with it. They turned the concert, which was meant to introduce Mick Taylor, into a tribute to Brian. It was a massive event. The estimates are around 250,000 fans.
And Mick Jagger read a poem.
He read an excerpt from Shelley's poem Adonais, which is an elegy, in memory of Jones.
And the visuals were so striking, they released thousands of butterflies.
They did, though in a somewhat grim but true detail. Because of the heat and the way they were stored, many of the butterflies just fell to the ground and failed to fly. But the symbolism was what mattered. This was the definitive end of the first era of the Rolling Stones.
And that same year, 1969, ends with an event that many historians mark as the symbolic death of 1960s innocence altogether.
Altamont.
The Altamont Free Concert in California.
It was meant to be a Woodstock West, but it's a complete disaster of planning and security from the start.
They hired the Hells Angels for security.
Yeah, they did. Famously paid them in beer. The whole atmosphere was violent and chaotic from the beginning of the day. And during the Stones set, a young fan named Meredith Hunter was stabbed and beaten to death by the Hells Angels right in front of the stage.
It's a terrifying moment to watch in the documentary Gimme Shelter. You can see the fear and confusion on the band's faces.
It marked a definitive shift. The whole peace and love idea of the 60s suddenly had this very dark, violent underbelly, and the Stones were right at the center of it. They'd courted this dangerous image for years, and at Altamont, that image became a terrifying reality.
And yet, even after all that darkness, creatively, they were entering what many people consider their golden era.
Absolutely. The period from 69 to 72 is just remarkable.
And this is when they finally created their definitive visual identity, the logo.
The tongue and lips. It's arguably the most famous, most recognizable logo in the history of rock music.
Where did it come from?
It originated around 1970. Mick Jagger went to the Royal College of Art. He was looking for a student to design a tour poster. He found a young designer named John Posh.
And Jagger gave him some direction?
He did. He suggested the Hindu goddess Kali as an inspiration, specifically her stuck-out tongue, which represents power and defiance.
So Posh took that idea and stylized it.
He combined that sense of spiritual aggression with the most obvious physical trait of Mick Jagger himself.
Of course. The lips.
The lips. It debuted on the inner sleeve of the Sticky Fingers album in 1971, and it just perfectly encapsulated the band. Anti-authority, a little bit lascivious, provocative. It became their corporate stamp. It's the Nike swoosh of rock and roll.
Speaking of corporate, we have to talk about money. Because in 1971, despite being the biggest band in the world, they were almost broke.
They were in a serious financial crisis. They discovered they owed a fortune in back taxes to the British government. They had been very poorly managed financially for years.
And what was the advice they got?
Their new financial advisor, Prince Rupert Lowenstein, told them the hard truth. He said, if you stay in England, you will be bankrupt. The tax rate for high earners in the UK at that time was punitive.
How high are we talking?
Up to 83% on earned income, and for some investment income, it could go as high as 98%.
So they had no choice. They became tax exiles. They had to leave their home country.
They moved to the south of France. And this wasn't a holiday. This was an evacuation. And this is what leads directly to the recording of one of their masterpieces, Exile on Main Saint.
At Keith Richards' rented villa, Nelcote.
Right. And they didn't record in the studio. They recorded the album in the basement.
In the basement of the villa.
In a series of damp, sprawling basement rooms. It was a chaotic environment, incredibly humid. The electricity was completely unreliable.
I read they were stealing power from the railway lines nearby.
Apparently so, which meant the voltage would fluctuate constantly and the equipment would cut out. You had the band and their whole entourage living upstairs, partying, and then they'd stumble downstairs at all hours of the night to record.
And you can hear that atmosphere in the music. Exile on Main Saint has this very murky, loose, almost swampy sound.
Critics were confused by it at first. The vocals are buried deep in the mix. It's not a clean-sounding record, but that murk is what makes it a masterpiece. It captures the sound of a band on the run, living in this decadent, humid isolation.
Moving into the mid-70s, the lineup changes again. Mick Taylor, who was so crucial to that golden run of albums, he resigns in 1974.
And this brings in Ronnie Wood. He came from the band The Faces, where he played with Rod Stewart. He joined in 1975, right before the Tour of the Americas.
And he was the perfect fit for Keith Richards.
The perfect foil. And this is where the band's sound changes technically. They develop this very unique style of playing that's often called the ancient art of weaving.
Can you explain what that means technically? What makes the weaving work?
A lot of it comes down to Keith Richards' use of open G tuning. He takes a standard Telecaster and he removes the lowest string, the sixth string, so he's only playing with 5 strings, tuned G to GBD. This creates this very specific, ringing, drone-like sound. It allows him to play rhythm and lead lines at the same time with very little effort. Because he occupies that unique sonic space, Ronnie Wood can then weave his standard-tuned guitar parts around him, filling in all the gaps.
So you can't always tell who is playing what.
Exactly. It creates this single, unified mesh of sound where it's hard to tell who is playing rhythm and who is playing lead. It creates that loose, slidey, incredible feel that defines the Stones' later sound.
But here's a fact that always surprises people. Ronnie Wood joins in 1975, but he wasn't immediately made a full partner in the band.
That's correct. He was a salaried employee for almost 2 decades.
So even though he was a Rolling Stone, on stage, on the albums,
Legally and financially, he was an employee. He did not become a full financial partner in the Rolling Stones business organization until sometime in the 1990s.
by the late 70s, the music world was changing again. Punk rock had arrived, disco was huge, and the critics were starting to call the Stones dinosaurs.
They were seen as part of the bloated rock establishment that punk was rebelling against. They were seen as obsolete. But the Stones did what they always seemed to do.
They adapted.
They adapted. In 1978, they released the album Some Girls.
Which is such a high-energy, stripped-down album.
It is. They went to New York and they just absorbed the energy of the city. You can clearly hear the punk influence on a track like Respectable. It's fast, it's aggressive, it's raw.
And you can definitely hear the disco influence on Miss You.
Oh, clearly. That classic four-on-the-floor beat, the prominent bass line that was dominating the clubs at the time. They took the two genres that were supposed to make them irrelevant, punk and disco, and they used them to create a massive comeback album.
And Some Girls was huge.
It went to #1 in the U.S. It proved they could still compete with the new generation on their own terms.
But while they were having this commercial resurgence, the internal relationship between Mick and Keith was falling apart. The 80s were a really rough period for them personally.
Right. This is the period that Keith Richards himself calls World War III.
What was the core of the conflict?
Well, the dynamic had shifted. During the 70s, Keith had been dealing with a very severe heroin addiction. And because of that, Mick Jagger had to take control of everything. The business, the logistics, the band's musical direction. Mick became the boss out of necessity because Keith was often incapacitated.
But in the 80s, that situation changed.
Keith got clean. He kicked heroin. And he wanted to take back his share of the leadership. But Mick had been running the show for a decade and wasn't really used to sharing that power anymore.
And Jagger's solo career was a big point of contention.
A huge one. Mick was pursuing a solo pop career, which Keith viewed as a profound betrayal of the band. Keith's view was that the Rolling Stones should always be the priority.
It got really bad. I read they barely spoke. They recorded the Dirty Work album in 1986 almost entirely separately.
They almost broke up. For a while there, it really looked like the end. But somehow they managed to pull it back from the brink. In 1989, they reconciled.
What brought them back together?
I think they realized that the Rolling Stones as an entity was bigger and more powerful than either of them individually. They set aside their differences and recorded the album Steel Wheels.
And the Steel Wheels tour. That really launched the modern era of the Rolling Stones, didn't it? This is where they become the touring juggernaut we know today.
This is a crucial pivot point, not just for them, but for the entire music industry. In 1989, they didn't just go on tour. They completely reinvented the business model of touring.
How so?
Before this, for most bands, tours were often loss leaders, just a way to promote album sales. The Stones flipped that math entirely. They moved into massive stadiums with these elaborate theatrical stage sets, giant inflatable dolls, pyrotechnics. The tour itself became the primary product.
It became a spectacle.
It became an industry. From the Steel Wheels tour onwards, through Voodoo Lounge, Bridges to Babylon, A Bigger Bang, they repeatedly set the record for the highest-grossing concert tour of all time. They basically created the template for the modern mega tour that acts like U2 and Taylor Swift follow today.
And the scale of these shows is just mind-boggling. The concert they did in Rio de Janeiro in 2006 is a perfect example.
The Copacabana Beach concert, it was a free show. The official audience estimate was 1.5 million people.
1.5 million. The logistics of just the sound for that many people seem impossible. How do you make sure the person a mile down the beach hears the music at the same time they see it on the screens?
It's an engineering marvel. The beach is about 2.5 kilometers long. Sound travels much, much slower than light. So if you just had speakers on stage, the people at the back wouldn't hear the snare drum hit until seconds after they saw Charlie Watts hit it. It would be a mess.
What did they do?
They had to set up a series of delay towers all the way down the length of the beach. And they had to mathematically calculate the precise millisecond delay for each tower so that the audio remained perfectly in sync with the visual experience for everyone, no matter how far back they were.
That's incredible. And behind all of this touring success is a very, very sophisticated financial structure. We mentioned they became tax exiles. That evolved into a corporate machine called Promo Group.
That's right. In 1972, they established a holding company called Promo Group. It has offices in the Netherlands and the Caribbean. It's what's often referred to in international finance as a Dutch sandwich or a royalty conduit.
Can you explain how that works in simple terms?
Essentially, the Netherlands has tax laws that are very favorable for royalty payments. By routing their earnings through this complex corporate structure, they were able to minimize their tax liability significantly.
And we're talking significantly.
There were reports that over a 20-year period ending in the mid-2000s, they paid a tax of just 1.6% on their total earnings of over $240 million.
1.6%. That's a staggering difference from the 83 or 98% they were facing back in the 70s.
It's the difference between being a band and being a multinational corporation. And they manage their archives just as shrewdly. The constant release of From the Vault, concert films, documentaries like Crossfire Hurricane, remastered albums, they keep the brand alive and generating revenue streams even when they aren't on the road.
Which brings us to the more recent years. And we have to address the major loss the band suffered in 2021.
The death of Charlie Watts.
Yeah.
This was a profound moment. Charlie Watts was the heartbeat of the Rolling Stones. He was a jazz drummer by training, not a rock drummer.
And that was his secret.
That was his secret. He didn't hit the hi-hat at the same time as the snare drum on the backbeat. He would leave this tiny, infinitesimal gap that created the wobble, the swing, that made the Stones sound like the Stones. He was also the quiet, grounded personality that balanced out the enormous egos of Mick and Keith.
He passed away in August 2021 at the age of 80. And many people thought, well, that has to be the end of the band.
It could have been. But Charlie had actually encouraged the band to continue if something happened to him. He had personally blessed Steve Jordan as his stand-in when he first fell ill. So the band continued their No Filter tour with Steve Jordan on drums, fulfilling Charlie's wishes.
And they didn't just keep touring. In 2023, they released Hackney Diamonds.
Which was so significant because it was their first album of original material in 18 years.
And the reception was incredibly positive.
Genuinely positive. It wasn't just a legacy act album where they were going through the motions. It had real energy. It featured contributions from Paul McCartney and even a rare guest appearance by Bill Wyman, the original bassist.
It proved that even in their 80s, they could still produce vibrant, relevant music.
It completely reinforced the idea that rock and roll doesn't have to be just for the young.
Before we wrap up, I want to touch on their legacy in a field you might not expect at all. Science.
Yes, the scientific tributes. They're surprisingly numerous. It turns out a lot of scientists are fans.
I read about the fossils.
That's right. There is a species of ancient stonefly named Petroperla mcjaggeri. There is another one named Lapisperla keithrichartzi. The scientists who discovered them actually created a whole new family of stoneflies called Petroperlidae, which comes from the Greek for stone to honor the band.
So they are literally part of the fossil record now.
And not just on Earth. NASA got involved too.
What did NASA do?
In 2019, the InSight lander on Mars, when it touched down, its thrusters disturbed a small rock and sent it rolling about 3 feet across the Martian surface. NASA officially named that rock Rolling Stones Rock.
So their name is physically present on another planet?
It is.
That's amazing. So we've covered Dartford Station all the way to Mars. From tiny blues clubs to Copacabana Beach. When you look at this entire arc from 1962 to the present day, what's the final conclusion?
I think the main takeaway is that the Rolling Stones stopped being just a band a very long time ago. They proved that rock and roll isn't just a flash in the pan or a young person's game. It can be a lifelong pursuit.
A career.
A whole life. They survived the death of a founder. They survived drug raids, prison sentences, internal wars, the changing tides of 6 decades of music.
Wow.
They survived everything. They are a persistent historical force. They wrote the blueprint for how a rock band can not only survive, but evolve and become a global institution.
They truly are. It's a story of survival just as much as it is a story of music. Thank you for walking us through this incredible history.
It was my pleasure.
And thanks for listening.